If you go on forums and social media, you may have read comments from people claiming that children can teach themselves to read and that they know someone that taught himself or herself to read. They normally also claim that these children learn to read just by picking up books around them and seeing words over and over. On top of that, many experts still sustain that children learn to read in the same way that they learn to talk. In their opinion, as long as children are surrounded by books, they will be able to figure out how to read. In their opinion, learning to read is a natural process. On the other hand, if you're a parent or an educator in charge of teaching children to read, you may have experienced something very different. You have probably not witnessed children learning to read so easily. Is it reasonable to expect for children to learn to read all by themselves? Are children that learn to read by themselves the norm or the exception? Are children naturally wired for learning to read in the same way that they are wired for learning to talk or walk? Let's find out in this video. But before we start, just a very quick announcement. On the video description, you will find some links to free materials and resources for teaching reading. Don't forget to check them out. Let's start by how we learn to read. This can really give us clues of how natural the process of learning to read really is. In the last few decades, neuroscience has uncovered what happens in the brain when we learn to read. In short, the following mechanisms need to take place. We need to specialize our brain visual system for the shapes of the letters. Then, via the phonology pathway, we need to connect these shapes to the speech sounds in the language. We then access and connect all of this information to the meaning of the words that we're reading, provided that they are in our vocabulary. When you become a fluent reader, all of these complex mechanisms happen automatically without giving any thought to it. However, the process of reading involves many regions of the brain working together in sync. The reading process is so complex that our brain is literally forced to change its structure to adapt to it. Besides, depending on how skilled you are, different parts of the brain are more active than others. According to the study, This Is Your Brain on Reading by Cunningham and Rose. Does this process happen naturally? Does our brain suddenly one day, little by little, start to recognize letter shapes and to connect them to the sounds that they represent without being given any proper explanation or context on how the alphabet system works first? Children normally need formal explicit training to learn about the letters and how they connect to sounds. This is not something that is hardwired in the brain. In other words, learning to read is not natural as learning to talk is. Why? The answer may be in how long we have been talking and how long we have been reading for. Humans' language capacity evolved about 100,000 years ago. This has given our brain enough time to fully adapt for language processing. Anyone, unless neurologically or hearing impaired, will learn to talk. It is not the same for learning to read. Humans began reading only a few thousand years ago. This, in evolutionary terms, is a recent occurrence. Even in countries as advanced as the US, 21% of adults have been found to have low-level English literacy, according to a 2019 report by the National Center for Education Statistics. If we were naturally wired for learning to read, this rate would not make any sense. Before the recent advances in neuroscience revealed how we learn to read, opinions about how we learn to read were just that, opinions, theories, speculation. The myth so tried that has been accepted as a fact that people learn to read naturally just by being immersed in print can lead and has led to flawed instructional practices. But how is it possible then that so many people claim that they know children that have learned to read all by themselves only by exposure to books and nothing else? What happens is that these children learn to figure out the connections that exist between letters and sounds by themselves. Studies have found that they read in the same way as any other reader. Exactly the same processes are going on in their brains. Those who think that these children just learn by remembering the words or just by being surrounded by books and print, well, it might seem like up to them, but in reality they just self-taught themselves to decode. These children are a minority though. It is very difficult to give an exact figure, but they certainly represent less than 5% of children. Finally, it is also important not to confuse proper reading with what some young children can learn to do with some words, especially if they are relevant to them. Recognize them and say them out loud. They could learn to recognize their names, words on signs, posters, etc. In the same way, anyone can recognize a familiar logo. These children are not reading though. Some other children that apparently are reading without explicit instruction could have just memorized familiar books. Those children can sometimes give the impression that they are extraordinary fluent readers, but if you give them an unfamiliar book, they will not be able to figure it out. If you have any further thoughts or comments on this topic, feel free to start a constructive conversation using the comments section. And if you found value on this video, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you do not miss out our weekly videos. For more information and resources about teaching reading, we invite you to visit learningreadinghub.com.